So my ex-mother-in-law called me 3 weeks ago, and the first thing she said was that her son had just left her house and he was driving to me and I needed to leave. Not go somewhere else in my apartment. Leave. Get in my car and drive somewhere he wouldn't think to look. I'm going to back up, because none of this makes sense without context, and honestly, I'm still trying to process everything that happened. Some of you might remember me posting in relationship advice when I was trying to figure out if my marriage was worth saving. I deleted that account, but I'm back because I need to get this out somewhere, and my therapist is on maternity leave and I can't afford the substitute she recommended. I was married to Kyle for 4 years. We met when I was 23 and he was 26. Got engaged after a year, married 6 months after that. Everyone told me it was fast, but when you know, right. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. When we were dating, he would show up at my job with lunch just because he was thinking about me. He planned this whole surprise trip to Savannah for my birthday where he'd researched all these little boutiques and restaurants he knew I'd love. I felt like the luckiest woman alive. But there was this other side to him that I didn't see until we moved in together after the wedding. Not violent, not at first anyway. Just this coldness that would come out of nowhere. We'd be having a totally normal evening and I'd say something, I never even knew what, and he'd just shut down completely. Wouldn't talk to me for hours, sometimes a whole day. When I'd ask what was wrong, he'd say I should know. That if I really loved him, I wouldn't have to ask. I grew up in this little town outside of Tulsa where my parents still live. It's one of those places where everyone knows everyone's business and you can't go to the grocery store without running into 3 people from church. When I married Kyle, we moved to his hometown in Tennessee, about 2 hours outside of Nashville, in this rural area where his family had been for generations. His mom, Miranda, lived about 20 minutes from us in the house Kyle grew up in after his dad passed. His sister, Talia, lived in Nashville but came home most weekends. Miranda was always kind to me. Like, genuinely kind. Not that fake Southern hospitality thing where they're sweet to your face and talk about you the second you leave. She would call just to check in, not to talk to Kyle, but to talk to me. She'd invite me over for coffee when Kyle was at work, and we'd sit on her porch, and she'd tell me stories about raising Kyle and Talia as a single mom after their dad died when Kyle was 12. The first time Kyle put his hands on me was about 18 months into the marriage. We were arguing about the dishes, which sounds so stupid typing it out, but that's how these things start, right? It's never some big dramatic moment. It's dishes, it's laundry, it's you forgot to text me back. He grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and pushed me into the kitchen counter. When I tried to leave the room, he blocked the doorway and told me we weren't done talking. I spent that whole night wide awake while he slept next to me like nothing happened. The next morning, he made me breakfast and acted like everything was fine, and when I finally brought it up, he said I was being dramatic and he barely touched me. That became the pattern. Something would set him off. He'd get physical or say something so cruel I couldn't breathe. Then the next day, everything was sunshine and he was the man I fell in love with again. I know how this sounds. I know people are going to ask why I didn't leave sooner. Trust me, I've asked myself that question 1,000 times. The answer is complicated. Part of it was that he had isolated me from most of my friends, without me even realizing it. Anytime I wanted to see someone, he'd have a reason why it wasn't a good time, or why that person was a bad influence, or why did I need other people when I had him. Part of it was financial. He controlled all our money and gave me an allowance like I was a child, even though I was working full-time. And part of it, honestly, was that I really believed it was my fault. That if I could just figure out the right way to be, the right things to say, the right way to anticipate his moods, I could make it work. Miranda saw the bruises once. It was maybe 6 months before I finally left. We were having dinner at her house and I reached for something and my sleeve rode up and she just stopped mid-sentence. Kyle wasn't in the room. He'd gone to get something from the car. And Miranda looked at me with this expression I'll never forget, and she said she'd seen that same look on her own face 30 years ago. She didn't say anything else because Kyle came back in. But when I was leaving, she hugged me longer than usual and told me her door was always open. Day or night, no questions asked. I finally left Kyle. The final thing wasn't even the worst thing he'd done. That's not how leaving works. It was just the moment when something in me clicked and I knew if I stayed, I was going to die in that house. He'd thrown a glass at me and it shattered against the wall next to my head, and he stood there looking at me with this expression like he was calculating whether he should have aimed better. I packed while he was at work the next day. Called my parents and told them I was coming home. Didn't tell anyone else, not even Miranda, because I was terrified he'd find out before I could get out. Just loaded everything I could fit into my car and drove the 8 hours back to Oklahoma without stopping. The first few weeks were this weird combination of relief and absolute terror. Relief because I was out, because I could sleep without one eye open, because I could breathe for the first time in years. Terror, because I knew Kyle and I knew he wasn't going to just let me go. He called constantly, dozens of times a day. Left voicemails that alternated between begging me to come back and telling me I was making the biggest mistake of my life and I'd regret this. I blocked his number, but he'd call from other phones. He showed up at my parents' house twice in the first month. Both times, my dad answered the door and told him to leave, and Kyle acted all reasonable and concerned. Like I was the one with a problem, like he was just a worried husband trying to reach his wife. My dad saw right through it, but what can you do when someone's standing on your porch acting normal and you can't prove anything? The divorce was ugly. Kyle fought everything. Every single thing. Even stuff he didn't want just because he didn't want me to have it. We had this coffee table that was mine from before we got married. Literally just a coffee table. And he contested it for 3 months. It cost us both more in legal fees than the table was worth, but that wasn't the point for him. The point was making my life as difficult as possible for as long as possible. Miranda called me a few times during this period, always when she knew Kyle wouldn't be around. She apologized for her son, which honestly broke me a little because what do you even say to that? She told me she was proud of me for leaving, that she wished she'd had the strength to leave Kyle's father when she had the chance before he died, that she'd made her peace with it, but she didn't want me to have the same regrets. The divorce was finalized about 2 months ago. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that he'd move on, find someone else to control, leave me alone. I was starting to rebuild my life, got a job at this place near my parents, not great money but enough, started reconnecting with old friends, was even thinking about maybe dating eventually. Not seriously, just like the possibility didn't feel completely impossible anymore. But Kyle didn't move on. The calls kept coming from blocked numbers. He'd leave these long, rambling voicemails about how I'd ruined his life, how everyone was asking about me and he had to make excuses, how I'd embarrassed him. Then the next one would be sweet, telling me he knew we could work it out if I just gave him another chance, reminding me of some good memory from our relationship, saying he'd been thinking about that trip to Savannah. About 6 weeks ago, the voicemails changed. They got darker. He started talking about how if he couldn't have me, nobody could, how I belonged to him and nothing, not a divorce, not a piece of paper, was going to change that. I saved all of them because I was scared. I didn't know what to do with them, but I saved them. I told my parents. My dad wanted to drive to Tennessee and confront Kyle directly, which would have been a disaster. My mom cried and asked why I hadn't told them sooner, and I could see her blaming herself, wondering what she missed when I was growing up that made me end up with someone like this. I hate that she felt that way because it wasn't her fault. It wasn't anyone's fault except Kyle's. I called the police, the local ones here in Oklahoma. They were sympathetic but said there wasn't much they could do since he was in another state. They suggested I get a protective order and gave me some pamphlets about domestic violence resources. The pamphlets were helpful, I guess, but they didn't make me feel any safer. The protective order took forever to get because Kyle was technically in Tennessee, and the jurisdictional stuff was complicated. When I finally got it, I felt like maybe I could exhale a little bit. It was just paper, but it was something. It meant if he showed up here again, the police could actually do something. 2 weeks after I got the order, Miranda called me. It was late, like after 9 at night, and when I saw her name on my phone, I knew something was wrong. Miranda didn't call late. She was one of those people who thought any call after 8 meant someone died. She was whispering, which was strange because she lived alone. She said Kyle had just left her house, that he'd come over for dinner, which he'd been doing a lot lately, more than usual, and this time he'd been different, agitated, pacing around, drinking more than normal. She said he kept asking her questions about me, where I was staying exactly, what my schedule was like, whether I was seeing anyone. Miranda told him she didn't know anything, which was partially true because I'd been careful not to give her specific details for exactly this reason. But Kyle didn't believe her. He got angry, started accusing her of taking my side, of being disloyal to her own son. She said she'd never seen him like that before, and remember, this is a woman who raised him, who knew him better than anyone. Then she said the thing that made everything else stop. She said when Kyle was leaving, she walked him to his truck like she always did, and she happened to look in the bed of the truck because he had the tonneau cover half off, and she saw a red gasoline can that hadn't been there when he arrived. She asked him about it, trying to sound casual, asking if he was having car trouble or something. Kyle just looked at her with this expression she'd never seen before, and said some things needed to burn before they could heal. Miranda said he drove off toward the highway that leads to Oklahoma. I need to stop here because this is already so long, and honestly, I'm shaking just typing this out. There's so much more, but I need a minute. I'll update soon, I promise. I just need to figure out how to even explain what happened next. First update. Okay, I'm back. Sorry for leaving it like that. I know that was cruel, but I genuinely couldn't keep going. I've been staying at my cousin Lana's place about 40 minutes from my parents because I couldn't stay at their house after everything that happened, and I also couldn't be alone. So where I left off, Miranda called and told me Kyle was driving to Oklahoma with a gasoline can in his truck and some cryptic shit about things needing to burn. When I tell you, I have never felt fear like that in my entire life. Miranda was still on the phone when I started moving. I grabbed my keys, my phone charger, my purse with my wallet, and I was out the door in probably under 2 minutes. I didn't pack anything else. I didn't think about clothes or toiletries or anything that a normal person would think about. I just knew I had to not be in that apartment when he got there. I called my parents from the car. My dad answered, and I was crying so hard he could barely understand me. When he finally got the basic information, he told me to drive to the police station and wait there. He said he and Mom would meet me. He said, do not go home, do not go to Lana's, do not go anywhere Kyle might think to look. Go somewhere public with cameras and police. That's what I did. I sat in the parking lot of the Tulsa police station for almost an hour waiting for my parents. Just sitting there in my car with the doors locked, watching every vehicle that pulled in. Every truck made me flinch. Every man walking by made my whole body tense up. My parents arrived and we went inside together and explained the situation to the officer at the desk. They took it more seriously than I expected, probably because I had the protective order and Miranda's warning. They put out some kind of alert, I don't know the technical term, basically telling officers to watch for Kyle's truck. Then we waited. My mom held my hand in the plastic chairs of that police station, and my dad paced like he does when he's trying not to lose his temper. We waited for hours without knowing where Kyle was. If he was still driving, if he'd gotten to my apartment, if he'd turned around, if he was sitting outside my parents' house right now. Around 1 a.m, one of the officers came to tell us they'd located Kyle. He was in a motel just outside of Oklahoma City, about 2 hours from where we were. He'd apparently stopped there and checked in under his own name, which was either stupid or deliberate, I still don't know which. They sent someone to check and confirmed his truck was in the parking lot. The thing about protective orders is that they don't mean you can't be in the same state as someone. They mean you can't come within a certain distance of them or their residence or workplace. Kyle wasn't violating anything by being in a motel in Oklahoma City. He wasn't near me. He wasn't near my apartment. He was just existing in the same state and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The police told me to stay somewhere he wouldn't expect that night. So I went to Lana's because Kyle had never met her, didn't know where she lived, and I was desperate for somewhere that felt safe. My parents wanted me to stay with them, but I couldn't put them in the middle of this. Not physically in the middle of it. If Kyle showed up at their house looking for me, I couldn't live with whatever might happen. I didn't sleep. Lana stayed up with me and we sat on her couch with all the lights on watching TV and neither of us pretending we weren't listening for sounds outside. Every time a car drove down her street, I stopped breathing until it passed. In the morning, Miranda called again. She said Kyle had come back, that he'd driven all that way and then just drove back without doing anything as far as anyone could tell. He showed up at her house around 9 a.m. looking exhausted, she said, and acting like nothing had happened. When she asked him where he'd been, he said he just needed to clear his head, that driving helped him think. She asked about the gasoline can. He said it was for his lawnmower. Miranda didn't believe him. She told me that, and I could hear in her voice how scared she was. Not scared of Kyle exactly, or not just scared of him, but scared of what he was becoming. She kept saying she didn't raise him to be like this, that she didn't know where this was coming from, that he'd always had a temper, but this was different. I asked her what she meant by different, and she got quiet. Then she said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. She said the last few months Kyle had been talking about me like I was still his wife, not like his ex-wife, like I was something that belonged to him and had been stolen. She said he referred to our apartment, the one in Tennessee that I hadn't lived in for 8 months, as our home, like I was just temporarily away. He talked about when I came back, not if. She said she'd tried to gently remind him that I wasn't coming back, that the divorce was final, that he needed to accept it and move on. And he'd looked at her and smiled and said she didn't understand how love worked. That's when I knew this wasn't going to just go away. This wasn't a phase or grief about the divorce or him processing things in his own time. This was something else. Something that was going to keep escalating until someone made it stop. I stayed at Lana's for almost a week. During that time, Kyle kept calling from blocked numbers, kept leaving voicemails that alternated between begging and threatening. I kept saving them all. The police said they were concerning, but not explicitly illegal, that he wasn't directly threatening violence. That saying things like, "You'll regret this, and I'm not going to let this go," could mean anything. Could mean anything. That's what they said. Like I was supposed to just wait around until he made a threat clear enough to count. Then about a week after the motel thing, Talia called me, Kyle's sister. We'd always gotten along okay during the marriage, not super close, but friendly enough. She'd been pretty quiet through the divorce, which I understood. He was her brother. Blood is complicated. I didn't expect her to take sides. But she was calling now, and she sounded upset. She said Miranda told her what happened, about the gasoline can and the drive to Oklahoma. She said she was worried about Kyle, really worried, and she thought maybe we should all sit down together and talk. Her, me, Kyle, and Miranda. Like a family meeting. I told her absolutely not. I said there was no scenario in which I was going to be in the same room as Kyle ever again. She tried to argue that he just needed help, that he was clearly going through something, that this was all coming from a place of pain, and if I could just see that maybe we could find a resolution that worked for everyone. I lost it. I told Talia that her brother had spent 4 years terrorizing me, that he'd put his hands on me more times than I could count, that he'd driven halfway across the country with gasoline in his truck after saying some things needed to burn. I told her I didn't give a damn about his pain, and I wasn't going to risk my life so she could feel like she'd done something. Talia said I was exaggerating, that Kyle had his issues but he wasn't dangerous, that I was making this into something it wasn't. She said maybe I was the one who needed help, that maybe I was paranoid and seeing threats where there weren't any. I hung up on her, blocked her number, added her to the list of people who could not be trusted. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't find out until later, was that Talia had already talked to Kyle, had already told him that I was staying with a cousin somewhere outside of Tulsa. She didn't know exactly where, but she knew enough. She'd given him information without thinking about what he might do with it. Miranda found out and called me immediately, and that's when things got so much worse. Second update. Okay, so I know I left everyone hanging, and I'm sorry, but things have been absolutely insane, and I'm only now at a point where I can sit down and type this out without my hands shaking too bad to hit the right keys. When I ended the last post, Miranda had just found out that Talia told Kyle I was staying with a cousin near Tulsa. Let me explain why that was such a big deal because I don't think I made it clear enough. Kyle didn't know I had a cousin named Lana. He'd never met her, never heard me talk about her really, because Lana and I had grown apart during my marriage. The way you grow apart from everyone when someone is slowly isolating you from your entire life. But Tulsa isn't that big and there aren't that many suburbs around it, and Kyle is smart. Give him a starting point and he'll figure out the rest. Miranda was furious with Talia in a way I'd never heard before. She called me that same night she found out, and I could tell she'd been crying. She kept apologizing over and over, saying she never should have told Talia anything, that she thought she could trust her own daughter, but clearly she was wrong. She said Talia had always been protective of Kyle, always made excuses for him, but this was different. This was actively putting me in danger, and Talia couldn't see it or didn't want to. I asked Miranda what exactly Talia had told Kyle. She said Talia admitted to telling him that I was scared and hiding out at some cousin's place near Tulsa because I thought he was going to hurt me. She'd framed it like she was trying to help. Like if Kyle just knew how afraid I was, maybe he'd back off and give me space. Like fear was going to make him reasonable when nothing else had. Miranda said Kyle's response was that I had no reason to be afraid, that he would never hurt me, that he loved me more than anything and just needed to talk to me face to face so we could work through this. That's what he said to Talia, and that's what Talia believed because she wanted to believe it because the alternative was admitting her brother was dangerous. I called Talia myself. I know I said I blocked her, but I unblocked her because I needed her to understand what she'd done. Not so she'd apologize, not so I'd feel better, but because maybe if I could get through to her, she'd stop feeding Kyle information. The conversation was a disaster from the start. Talia answered and immediately started talking about how I needed to calm down, how everyone was overreacting, how Kyle just wanted closure. I cut her off and told her closure wasn't showing up in someone's state with gasoline in your truck after saying things need to burn. She said I was taking that out of context. I asked her what possible context made that okay. She didn't have an answer, but she kept trying to find one. I told Talia about the bruises. I told her about the time Kyle threw a glass at my head. I told her about the nights I slept with my keys in my hand in case I needed to run. I told her things I hadn't told anyone except Miranda and my parents because I thought maybe if she heard it directly from me, she'd get it. She was quiet for a long time and then she said that wasn't the brother she knew, that Kyle had always been intense but never violent, that maybe I misremembered or maybe I'd done something to provoke him. Like I deserved to have glassware thrown at my skull because I said the wrong thing at dinner. I told Talia that I was done trying to make her understand, that her brother was stalking me and she was helping him, and if anything happened to me, it would be on her conscience. She started crying and saying I was being cruel, that she was just trying to help everyone, that family was supposed to stick together. I told her I wasn't her family anymore and Kyle had made sure of that. For the next few days, nothing happened, which somehow made it worse because I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'd check my phone constantly, jump at every notification, watch the street from Lana's window like Kyle was going to materialize out of thin air. The fear was exhausting in a way I can't really describe, like being tired all the time but also unable to sleep. Then Kyle called me, not from a blocked number, from his actual phone with his name on the screen. I stared at it ringing for probably 10 seconds before I answered. I don't know why I answered. Some part of me thought maybe if I talked to him directly I could make him understand that it was over, that there was nothing left to fight for, that he needed to move on. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. His voice was calm when he answered. He said my name like a question, like he wasn't sure I'd actually pick up. I said I was here. He asked how I was doing and I laughed, this harsh, angry sound that surprised both of us. I asked him how he thought I was doing. Running from him, hiding at relatives' houses, afraid to go back to my own apartment. Was that what he wanted to know? He said he was sorry, that he never meant for things to get this out of hand, that he'd been struggling since I left and he wasn't handling it well, and he knew that. He said he'd been doing some thinking and he realized he needed to make some changes and he wanted me to know he was committed to being better. I asked him if that's why he drove to Oklahoma with a gasoline can in his truck. Silence. Then he said his mom shouldn't have told me about that it wasn't what I thought, that he'd never hurt me, never in a million years, that the gas was for something else entirely, and I was taking it the wrong way. I asked him what I was supposed to think when my ex-husband drives halfway across the country after saying things need to burn. He said I was twisting his words, that burn was a metaphor for letting go, for cleansing, for starting fresh. He said he'd been planning to have a bonfire, to burn old photos and memories, to symbolically release me so he could move forward. I didn't believe him. I told him that. I said even if that was true, which I didn't think it was, driving to my state in the middle of the night wasn't how you let someone go. That was how you scared them. That was how you made them feel hunted. He asked me if I really thought he was capable of hurting me. After everything we'd been through, after 4 years of marriage, did I really think he was a monster? I said I didn't think anything. I knew. I knew what his hands felt like when he grabbed me. I knew what it felt like to have glass shatter next to my head. I knew what it felt like to lay awake wondering if tonight was the night he went too far. He said I was remembering things wrong, that I was making him out to be someone he wasn't, that he'd never laid a hand on me, not once. And if I believed that, then maybe I was the one who needed help. I told Kyle I had photos of the bruises. I'd taken them secretly and saved them to a cloud account he didn't know about. I told him I had voicemails, dozens of them, some begging, some threatening, all proof that he'd been harassing me for months. I told him I wasn't confused or crazy or misremembering. I had evidence, and if he ever came near me again, I'd use it. He laughed, and then his voice changed completely, dropped that fake, gentle tone, and became the Kyle I knew from all those terrible nights. He said evidence didn't matter when no one would believe me. He said his family knew the truth about me and so did everyone in our town, and if I tried to smear his name, he'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. I asked him what kind of person that was. He said the kind who abandons their husband when things get hard. The kind who runs away instead of working on problems. The kind who turns family against each other and poisons his mother against her own son. He said I'd already taken Miranda from him, that she looked at him differently now, and that was my fault. I hung up. I was shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. Lana came running in because apparently I'd been yelling without realizing it. She asked what happened, and I couldn't even speak, just handed her my phone so she could see the call log, see that it was him. Lana wanted to call the police. I told her they wouldn't do anything because he hadn't explicitly threatened me. That's the sick joke of all this. He can terrify me, stalk me, drive to my state with gasoline, call me, and deny all the abuse. And none of it counts as an actual threat because he's careful with his words. I called my dad, told him about the conversation, told him I was done hiding and done running. I wanted to go back to my apartment, the one I'd been too scared to return to. I wanted to reclaim my life. My dad said he'd come with me, that we'd go together, that I didn't have to do any of this alone. We went the next day. My apartment felt strange after almost 2 weeks away. My friend had done a good job cleaning it out, but some stuff was still there. Things too big to fit in her car. A bookshelf, some furniture, the smell of the place, that specific combination of old building and the candle I always burned. I was standing in the living room looking around when there was a knock at the door. My dad tensed up immediately, moved toward it, asked who it was. No answer. He looked through the peephole and then looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. He said it was Kyle. My body went cold. Kyle was supposed to be in Tennessee. Kyle wasn't supposed to know I was here. We'd been so careful, hadn't told anyone except my parents about coming to the apartment today. My dad told me to go to the bedroom and stay there. I told him no, I wasn't hiding anymore. Not from Kyle, not in my own home. We argued in whispers for a few seconds while Kyle knocked again, louder this time, saying my name, saying he just wanted to talk. Finally, my dad opened the door. Not all the way, just enough to see Kyle standing there. Kyle looked surprised to see my dad, clearly hadn't expected anyone else to be there. He tried to look past my dad into the apartment and I stepped forward so he could see me. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to know I wasn't cowering anymore. Kyle started talking immediately, saying he knew I was upset, he knew things had gotten out of hand, but if I would just hear him out for 5 minutes, he could explain everything. He said he'd driven all this way because I wasn't answering his calls, and he needed me to understand. He said he loved me. He said he'd always love me. He said we took vows, and those meant something. Or at least they did to him. My dad told Kyle he needed to leave, that there was a protective order, and Kyle was violating it right now just by standing there. Kyle said he didn't care about the order, that piece of paper didn't mean anything, that our marriage meant more than any legal document. I stepped past my dad. He grabbed my arm trying to stop me, but I shook him off. I stood in the doorway, maybe 3 feet from Kyle, and I told him exactly what I thought of him for the first time in my entire life. I told him he was a coward who hit women and then pretended it didn't happen. I told him he was a manipulator who isolated me from everyone who loved me so he could control me completely. I told him the 4 years I spent with him were the worst years of my life, and every single day since I left had been better than any day I spent as his wife. I told him he disgusted me and I felt nothing for him anymore except pity for whatever emptiness inside him made him think this was love. He looked at me like I was something to be dealt with, not a person, just an obstacle. He said I'd regret this. Not angry, not yelling, just calm and certain. He said I had no idea what I'd started. Then he turned and walked away, got in his truck and drove off. My dad wanted to call the police immediately. I said yes, we should, but I already knew nothing would come of it. Kyle would say he didn't know the apartment was my residence since I'd been staying elsewhere. He'd say he just wanted to have a civil conversation. He'd say I was exaggerating and making things up, and the police would have to take his word for it because that's how this works. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't find out until 2 days later, was what Kyle did after he left my apartment, where he went, what he bought, what he was planning. Miranda called me. She was barely coherent, crying so hard I could hardly understand her. She said she'd just gotten off the phone with someone at the gas station near her house, a family friend who worked there. The friend had called to ask if everything was okay with Kyle because he'd come in and bought 3 more gasoline cans and filled them all up, and he'd been talking to himself in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before driving off. 3 more cans, plus the one he already had. 4 gasoline cans. Miranda said she'd been trying to call Kyle, but he wasn't answering. She'd driven past his house and his truck wasn't there. She asked if I knew where he was, and I said no, I didn't. He'd left my apartment hours ago and I hadn't heard from him since. She said there was something else. Something she probably should have told me earlier, but she'd been hoping it wouldn't matter. Hoping Kyle would calm down. Hoping none of this would happen. She said Kyle had been asking her questions about my parents' house. Not my apartment, my parents' house. He wanted to know if they had a security system, if they had any dogs, if their nearest neighbor was close enough to hear anything at night. I called my parents immediately. My mom answered and I told her to get Dad and get out of the house right now. Don't pack anything, don't worry about the dog, just leave and drive somewhere, anywhere, and call me when they were safe. My mom started asking questions and I didn't have time to explain. I just kept telling her to go, please trust me and go. I heard her calling for my dad in the background, heard the confusion in her voice, heard the fear starting to creep in when she realized how serious I was. My dad got on the phone. He wanted answers I couldn't give him. I told him Kyle had gasoline, lots of it, and he'd been asking about their house. My dad went quiet. Then he said they'd leave right now and call me from the car. I spent the next 45 minutes pacing Lana's living room, checking my phone every 30 seconds, praying for it to ring. When it finally did and I saw my mom's name, I almost collapsed with relief. They were safe. They were at a diner about 20 miles from their house. They hadn't seen Kyle or his truck anywhere. I told them to stay there. I told them I was calling the police, and this time I was going to make them listen. I had enough now. The gasoline cans, the questions about their house, the confrontation at my apartment, all of it together painted a picture that even the most skeptical cop couldn't ignore. Except when I called and explained everything, the dispatcher said they'd send someone to check on my parents' house and keep an eye out for Kyle's vehicle. They said there still wasn't enough for an arrest. Being in someone's state wasn't a crime. Buying gasoline wasn't a crime. Asking questions about a house wasn't a crime. I asked what was a crime then. What did he actually have to do before someone would stop him? I stayed on the phone with Lana's landline, calling everyone I could think of while texting my parents with my cell phone. I called Miranda back and told her what was happening. I called the non-emergency police line in both Oklahoma and Tennessee, trying to find someone who would take this seriously. I called the domestic violence hotline from one of those pamphlets the police had given me weeks ago. Everyone said they understood how scary this must be. No one could actually do anything. It was almost midnight when Miranda called again. She said she'd made a decision, that Kyle was her son and she loved him, but she couldn't watch him destroy himself and everyone around him. She said she was going to do something she should have done years ago. I asked her what she meant. She said Kyle wasn't the first person in their family to be like this, that his father had been the same way, worse actually, and she'd lived with it for 23 years until he died. She said she had things from that time, things she'd kept hidden even from her own children, things that might help me. She said she was going to tell me the truth about Kyle's father, and about what she'd seen Kyle do before he ever met me. That's where I'm going to have to leave this for now. Miranda is driving here tonight all the way from Tennessee because she says some things need to be said in person. My parents are staying at a hotel nearby, not going home until we know where Kyle is. And somewhere out there, my ex-husband is driving around with 4 cans of gasoline and a head full of whatever twisted logic convinces him this is love. I'll update when I can. Last update. Miranda arrived at Lana's house around 2 in the morning. We sat at Lana's kitchen table and she told me she'd been driving since early evening. Couldn't sleep anyway, might as well be moving. She started talking about Kyle's father, about how he'd been charming too, how everyone loved him, how she'd felt so lucky when they got married, about how that changed behind closed doors. I stopped her, told her I appreciated what she was trying to do, but I already knew this story. I'd lived it. What I needed to know was what she'd meant about Kyle doing things before he met me. Miranda got quiet, picked at a thread on her sleeve. Finally, she said when Kyle was 19, he'd had a girlfriend named Emmeline. The relationship ended badly. Emmeline had moved across the state afterward and refused to talk to anyone from their town ever again. Miranda never knew exactly what happened, but she'd seen bruises on that girl too. She told herself it was nothing, that Kyle was young, that he'd grow out of it. She'd been wrong. I asked why she never told me any of this. She said she wanted to believe Kyle had changed, that when he brought me home and I was so happy and he seemed so different, she convinced herself the thing with Emmeline was a one-time mistake. She said she'd failed me, and she knew it. Around 5 in the morning, Miranda's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and I saw her whole body tense. Kyle. She looked at me asking without words what she should do. I nodded. She answered and put it on speaker. Kyle asked where she was. His voice was flat, controlled in that way I knew meant he was barely holding it together. Miranda told him she was in Oklahoma, with me. The silence that followed was so heavy I could feel it pressing on my chest. He laughed, this bitter, angry sound, and said of course she was. Of course she'd driven all that way to turn me against him even more. He asked what lies she was telling me now. I spoke up, told him she wasn't lying about anything, that she loved him and she was terrified of what he was becoming. I told him I knew about Emmeline. The line went quiet for a second and then he said, I didn't know anything about that. That Emmeline was crazy, that she'd made things up, that everyone knew she was unstable. I asked Kyle where he was. He said it didn't matter. I asked about the gasoline. He said I was obsessed with that I was making something out of nothing, that he'd already explained about the bonfire. Miranda took the phone off speaker and held it to her ear. What happened next was the hardest thing I've ever witnessed. A mother talking to her son like she was already grieving him. She told Kyle she loved him, that she'd always love him, that nothing he did would ever change that. But she also told him she couldn't protect him anymore, that she'd spent his whole life making excuses and looking the other way, and it had only made things worse. I could hear Kyle through the phone, not the words but the tone, angry, accusing her of choosing me over him, of betraying her own son, of being just as bad as everyone else who'd abandoned him. Miranda told Kyle he needed help, not her covering for him, not Talia pretending nothing was wrong, actual professional help for whatever was broken inside him. She said if he got that help, she'd be there every step of the way. But if he didn't, If he kept going down this path, she was going to have to choose between being his mother and being a person she could live with. And she'd already spent too many years being someone she couldn't live with. Kyle hung up on her. We didn't hear anything for almost 6 hours. Miranda tried calling him back multiple times, but he never answered. My parents stayed at the hotel. Lana stayed with us even though I told her she didn't have to. We all just waited, nobody saying what we were all thinking. That somewhere out there Kyle was driving around with gasoline and rage and nothing left to lose. The police called my parents around noon. Kyle had shown up at their house. A neighbor had seen his truck in the driveway and called it in because my dad had warned everyone on the street about the situation. By the time officers arrived, Kyle was just sitting in his truck in the driveway with the engine off. The gasoline cans were in the truck bed. All 4 of them, but they were still sealed. He hadn't done anything. He was just sitting there. They arrested him for violating the protective order. Finally, something they could actually charge him with. When they searched his truck, they found a lighter and some rags along with the gas cans. He tried to say it was all for yard work, but the officer who called my parents said they weren't buying it. Kyle is in custody now. There's a hearing next week. His lawyer is arguing that he never actually threatened anyone, never did anything with the gasoline, just made some poor choices during an emotional time. Maybe that's true legally. Maybe he'll get out with a slap on the wrist. I don't know. What I do know is that Miranda gave a statement to the police, told them everything she'd told me about Kyle's behavior, about his father, about the things she'd seen over the years. Talia found out and called her mom screaming about betrayal and family loyalty. Miranda told Talia she was welcome to keep lying to herself if that's what she needed, but she was done participating. My parents went home yesterday. My dad hired someone to install better locks and a security camera. I'm back at Lana's for now. I don't know how long I'll stay. I still don't know what would have happened if he'd gotten to my parents' house before someone called the police. If those gas cans would have stayed sealed. If whatever he was planning was just a fantasy he liked to terrify me with, or something he actually intended to do. I guess I'll never know. And maybe that's the worst part. Living with the almost, the what if, the knowledge that the only thing standing between me and whatever Kyle had planned was his mother's courage and a neighbor who paid attention. That's where I'm at. Still scared sometimes, but also still here.